With Augmented Human, I wanted to push the boundaries of what I could create as a solo indie musician on a shoestring budget, using digital tools available to everyone. I'll be showing you the entire process of making this music video, so stick around if you want to find out how you can also make shots like this, or this. I just want to note that I didn't have a team with me, only one person to shoot the footage, so everything you're about to see is stuff that you can also do. This is going to be a deep dive behind the scenes, so get comfortable, grab your favorite beverage, and let's go. A quick word on how I came up with the concept for the video. Augmented Human is a pretty difficult song to play and has some tapping riffs that evoke a kind of robotic pattern of movement. This inspired me to make a video on the theme of blending human and machine together. In the early planning, I decided to split the footage between outdoor scenes with an urban environment that was compatible with the cyberpunk aesthetic I was going for, and some indoor scenes where I could control the lights and create a darker ambience. I watched a lot of music videos to get some ideas on the camera movements and angles I could use, as well as effects and editing techniques. Once I got a more precise image of what I wanted to make, I wrote down a sort of script of each scene in the video and what I wanted to do with it. As always, before heading out to shoot the video, I wrote down a list of all the shots that we had to do, including the camera settings, gimbal settings. I also wrote down the tempos for the various parts of the song in case I needed to use a click. Shooting outdoors can be a pretty stressful experience, so I find that having a list of everything that you need to do with all the settings takes a lot of the mental load off and allows me to just focus on performing. We used a Lumix S5 camera with a 35mm lens for most of the shots. The gimbal footage was done with a Ronin RS3 Mini. The outdoor footage was shot under a highway. The barriers around us allowed us to shoot without having passers-by getting too close or interrupting us. But there were a couple of challenges. The area was so noisy that I couldn't hear a single note that I played. Here's a sample of what it was like. I was glad I had rehearsed beforehand. I used noise-cancelling earbuds the whole time. For most of the song it was just a click, but for some parts that had more nuance or longer notes, I actually played the studio recording so I could try to match it as closely as possible. The other challenge was the weather. You don't really see it in the video, but it was raining almost all the time. The luminosity was changing a lot, so we had to adjust the camera settings all the time. And also it was around 12 degrees Celsius, so my hands were very red, practically purple, which took a lot of work to fix in post. This reminded me a bit of the Essence of Time music video where I faced a similar issue. We used a mix of handheld shaky cam footage for action and intensity, and some gimbal shots to establish the setting and show the guitar playing more clearly. In total, it took about 3 hours to shoot everything. The indoor footage was less stressful. It was done in our living room. For these shots, I was standing on my knees in front of the television with a music visualizer of the song playing. I used a custom milk drop preset. For those of you old enough to remember, that's the visualizer that was originally developed for Winamp, and yes, it still exists today. For these shots, I just put up a black cloth and used two-point lighting. The difficulty was to make sure that the lights didn't spill on the cloth. I used very rudimentary lighting gear. I don't have softbox, so on the key light, I literally used a grocery bag covered in black cloth to help focus the light. On the fill light, I placed a piece of cardboard on the panel to avoid light spilling to the sides. And finally, this shot. I did a test run for it a few months prior, which I shared with you guys. I used a clamp to attach the camera to the guitar and the bass's body. The main camera was too heavy to use, so these were shot with a compact Sony RX100. I wanted to use a high shutter speed, so I had to stand extremely close to the lights to get enough exposure. On this camera, shooting in 4K drains the battery in about 5 minutes. I had 2 spares, but I knew I had to be very quick. I ended up shooting all the footage that you see in the video in about 4 minutes on a single battery. And that was all the footage done. The rest now happens entirely on the computer, and if you ask me, that's where things get really interesting. I ended up with about 160 gigabytes of 4K log footage. There was enough footage to basically make the entire video twice using only the indoor or the outdoor scenes. The very first step was to sort through all the footage, eliminate the unusable shots and sync the good ones with the song on the timeline. The outdoors footage, this was done entirely visually because if you recall, the sound of the video was like this. This was the most tedious part of the editing process, but once I compiled everything into a single multicam timeline, it made things easier for the more creative parts. I first did a rough edit while playing the video in real time. On the left of my screen I had like a wall of all the available angles, and on the right I had the currently selected angle, so all I had to do was to click on the angle I wanted to cut to it. When this was done, I had the basis from where to refine the edits and adjust the cuts to better sync with the music. After that, I moved on to the color grading. I went for a blue-greenish overall tint. One of the most time-consuming parts of the process was fixing the skin tones. Like I mentioned earlier, for the outdoors shots, my skin was practically purple. For the indoor scenes, since I used hard lights, it makes the skin look rough, so I need to soften it a bit during the editing process. Another thing that took a lot of time was adding a subtle lens flare and animating it with the camera movements in almost every shot of the video. It's a matter of personal preference, but personally I'm a sucker for this kind of aesthetic. For some of the shaky cam shots, I added a couple of different lens dirt overlays. To make them look more realistic, I used a Luma Keyer to only have them appear on the brighter parts of the image. Here's an ungraded shot. The same with color grading, and the final look with all the added effects. For the indoors footage, I cleaned up the background to make the cloth invisible and have the background completely black. I also had to manually remove some objects that were visible in some of the shots. For the bridge camera shots, I added the lens flare to reproduce the glow you would expect from the spotlight. For all the shots, I manually animated the color changes of the lens flare to match the real light's color. These color-changing lights look great in the video, but they demanded a lot of additional work I hadn't planned for. So in future videos, if you see me using a fixed color light, you'll know why. Now let's talk about these shots. I don't think I've seen these types of shots used in a lot of guitar videos, at least they're probably not very common. So to make these, you need to shoot in a single, steady orbit trajectory around the subject. Afterwards, you can stabilize the footage using the planar tracker and Resolve. You'll need to zoom in a bit or use other tricks to avoid black edges appearing to the side of the screen, because the stabilization will move the picture around as it tries to compensate for the camera's jerkiness. So I'd recommend you shoot with a slightly wider angle than what you want to end up with. And finally, there's the speed ramp itself. Basically, you start fast, then slow down, then accelerate again, and use curves to ease in and out of the speed changes. These weren't super clean because it was the first time we attempted them, but I kept them because they were an important part of my vision for this video. The 3D sphere that emits pulsating lights with the music and is held by cables is meant to represent a machine's brain or heart. This was my very first project in 3D animation. I used a free software called Blender. I had a precise idea of what I wanted to make, but I had no idea how to do any of it, so I watched a bunch of tutorials, grabbed the stuff I wanted from each of them, like how to do the mesh, the animated light with the music, the camera movements. The animation was ray traced and rendered in 4K, which takes a lot of computation time. So I left the computer on to render during the night when I went to sleep. I only rendered about 15 seconds of animation, which I used throughout the video. And for the outro, I just played it in reverse to have the camera moving away from the sphere. Here's a comparison between the viewports, the render, and the final graded version. There's a lot of debate right now around the use of AI to generate images. I wanted to see if this technology could also be used as a way to make visual effects. The idea was to make myself look like a cyborg in some of the shots. I know some people will say I stopped being an artist and became a soulless prompt jockey the second I decided to use AI. Look, if that's what you think, I'm not going to try to convince you. But for the rest of you, I wanted to dive deeper into the process. And let me tell you this, there's a lot more to this than just typing some prompts. The process was to take my own footage, transform it with AI, and then composite the generated images over the original footage. First, I selected all the shots I wanted to transform. I removed any effect they had on them and exported them into a folder. I named them with their timestamp to keep things tidy. Then, one by one, I transformed them using Stable Diffusion through a software called Comfy UI. Let me show you. Comfy UI is essentially a modular node-based interface that allows you to build pipelines to achieve whatever you want, in my case, transforming an existing video. To make a music analogy, think of it like running your footage through a signal chain. Before making the video, I spent a few weeks learning about the different nodes and settings and experimenting with some test footage. My final workflow looked like this. My original footage goes through something called IP Adapter that guides the generated images to follow the source more or less closely. The signal, to keep the analogy, then goes through a series of LoRa's, basically specialized small models which I used to orient the generation towards a cyberpunk style. Then it went through the prompt itself, then through a series of control nets. Each one analyzed the footage in a different way to further control the generated images. Depth map, animation skeleton, edge detection. Each of the parameters you see in the various nodes had to be adjusted for each shot through trial and error to get the best results. Finally, all these instructions were fed into a sampler in which the Stable Diffusion model processed them to create the animation. Once I had all the animations, I used another AI to upscale them to 4K and then imported everything into the project in Resolve. For each shot, I outlined the elements I wanted to composite over my footage. Then I animated those outlines frame by frame to follow the movements. At this point, the AI footage looked out of place. I needed to adjust the colors to blend it better with the underlying footage, and then I added all the post-processes to get the final results. One thing to be very mindful of when compositing shots is the black point. You want the darkest points to be of similar color on both shots, or it will look out of place. I finished by adding some in and out transitions and some overlay effects. And finally, these shots. I bet some of you are wondering how they were made if I used a drone. I used a technology called Neural Radiance Fields, or NeRF, which basically allows you to reconstruct a still scene from the real world into 3D. And from there, you can imagine any camera movement that you want. A couple months ago, I went to the planned location and shot some footage with my phone, which I then uploaded to the Luma AI website to see if the technology could work for my purpose. For the actual video, I stood still while Serena walked around me, capturing the scene from 3 different heights. These are some early tests I did with the footage using an NVIDIA software. After extracting stills from the video, I ran a script using the Colmap software to analyze how the camera moved around in the scene, and then fed all of that into the NeRF software to reconstruct the scene in 3D. For the final video, I created the various camera trajectories and exported the scenes, which I then reworked in Resolve. I did some color grading and then added some effects to better blend them with the rest of the footage. I added some grain, some motion blur. This tech enabled me to do some crazy camera movements which would have been impossible for me to do otherwise. For example, these shots mimic the kind of movements you get with a camera robot arm. This wide orbit shot was sort of a nod to The Matrix, which are my favorite movies and also relevant to the theme of this video. And the best thing is that anybody can do this using just a camera from your phone, so I encourage you to try it. Once the AI 3D and NeRF shots were added to the video and edited together, the video was ready. Between learning the various technologies and software involved, planning and shooting the scenes and editing everything together, The video took about 3 months to make. For the music, it was about also 3 months to compose and record everything. So in total, this was a 6-month project, and that's why I haven't released a lot of stuff in that time. For now, I want to focus on making more songs, so my next few videos will probably be less ambitious than this one, but I will still try to use some of the knowledge I gained making this. Since I started making videos, a key aspect of my approach has been to have a clear objective in my mind and go straight for it, using very specific resources and tutorials to achieve the desired results in a minimal amount of time. The downside of this approach is that it skips a lot of the basics, so whether that's a good method for you depends on your goal. Do you want to achieve the desired results in the most efficient way possible, or do you want to become comfortable with all the tools that you use? I think a healthy balance between those two mindsets will allow you to expand your knowledge while also be able to produce things that would normally be beyond your skill set. That's all for this deep dive. I hope it showed you that as an indie musician with almost no budget for videos, you can still create some pretty cool things with some decent video gear and a computer. Let me know in the comments if it gave you some ideas for your own music videos, and also let me know if you'd like me to make a video about the essential gear you should acquire to make your own music videos. And lastly, I want to give a shout out to Serena for her patience and dedication in shooting this music video. That's all for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.